Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Tom Sear, who is one of Australia's leading commentators, researchers, and advisors on democratic resilience in an era of cyber conflict and social media manipulation. Tom has advised the Australian and New Zealand governments, along with the U.S. Department of Defense, on cybersecurity and social media manipulation, counter-influence initiatives, and digital literacy policy. His PhD concerns how to build tolerant national cultures in social media to defend pluralistic societies. Tom led grant-funded data analysis projects to analyze cross-platform nation-state social media propaganda influence operations during the recent Australian federal election. Tom is an advisor and cybersecurity practitioner to government and industry. He is an experienced and DST grant-funded researcher in global multi-platform social media analysis, including cross-lingual work with WeChat. Tom Sear, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
G'day, John. How's it going?
Fantastic, thanks. The discussion that we'd love to have with you today is about a recent article that you wrote called Xenowar Dreams of Itself, and we will put a link to the article in the show notes for our audience to go check it out. But your article is fantastic. It is partly a work of fiction, but you also interleave into the fiction some rigorous discussion that includes all kinds of important considerations for the world that we find ourselves in and the world that is emerging. So, topics include everything from, what is sovereignty to data stacks to the philosopher on war, Clausewitz, gray zone operations, deep fakes, cybernetics, on and on and on. PTSD in an AI fueled world. I mean, your article is fantastic. So why don't we start with why did you write this article in the first place? Give us a little background, please.
Yeah, so I guess as Frank Zappa said, I didn't start out to be weird. It just turned out that was the way that I had to respond to the problems. So
all right.
I'm trying to.
That is the very first Frank Zappa reference on the Cognitive Crucible. There you go.
Put that down. Frank has to be there somewhere.
Nailed it.
Right. So I guess I started to think, well, we often hear about, digital changes happening, wars changing, Clausewitz is changing, the future's going to be crazy. But I sort of try to think, well, what does it mean to go back to first principles and think about those things? What is information? What is data? What is computation? What is Clausewitz? And to try and think about those from a first principles perspective, and then begin to understand, well, from that perspective, let's examine how the future might operate and how it might actually get weird into the future, and precisely how would it get weird, and what stays quote unquote normal, and what doesn't in terms of our environments. And so that's kind of where it started. And then you start to begin to think, well, what is the revolution we're currently in? What does it mean? And I suppose we could talk to that for some time about the history of that, how we moved from sort of all the way at scale to the last 100 years, and what World War II brought to us in terms of information, and what the revolution of World War II in an information environment really meant. And as opposed to, we have computers now, what does it mean? What is computation? So I guess probably the threshold for us is probably the Second World War. For example, there wasn't enough typewriters in the United States to run the Pentagon when the Pentagon was being built. And so what we see with the invention in World War II is really a restructure and understanding of what is information. And obviously Turing and von Neumann, the way the bomb was developed this new kind of understanding of what is value within information and what is information. Like, it's a very strange thing, information. What is it? It's kind of like, it's an abstraction that sort of has meaning, semantic meaning, but is also tied to a material substrate. And so it has this kind of oscillatory, kind of odd ontological quality of it. And I suppose in the last 20 to 30 years, I suppose, we've seen sort of a revolution in military affairs around the nature of epistemology, which is kind of how we know what we know. And I guess epitomized most famously by that famous Rumsfeld quote everyone pulls out. But what does that really mean? So I think probably what's happened in World War II is the episteme has rechanged, has restructured our ontological framework. So I tried to go back in this piece and work out what is other, like xeno is the Greek word for really otherness or the alien, and what is cognition in terms of information operations and computation operations, and how do those two things intercede? And then how does Clausewitz intercede? And then what is Clausewitz? So try to first principles. What is he actually, because of his wife is obviously critical in writing those books, and what epistemological revolution are they exploring in their work, and does it still fit? And I guess, to return to Frank Zappa again, it did end up pretty weird. And as you say, there's a fictional piece at the start, because I'm a fan of August Cole and Pete Singer's work. And so I thought, well, it's probably easier to try and explain the problem set intellectually here and all this theory in actually an example which is set in the present. So the story starts with a girl who's probably 12 or 13 in Western Sydney it's set October 1 in Western Sydney, Australia. And how is her data used, her activity online today, weaponized in a war into the future in, say, 2035, 2040? What does that mean? And in terms of all this other discussion that I'm trying to sort of unpick, and it brings, I guess it's not the most pleasant of stories. It does involve some fairly nasty deep fakes and large scale critical infrastructure, cyber storm events or cyber blitzkrieg events, which are occurring out to 2035. And then I'm trying to sort of, I guess, challenge everyone today, because we think about the future as being in the future, but what's really happened is this idea of recursion. So what's critical to Clausewitz, Hegel, World War II, the invention of the computer, the fundamental principle which underlies all that is this idea of biodynamic feedback. And that's what that's where cyber comes from, in the sense of its use as a word, as a form of governance, via the obvious famous characters. So that's a long and rather rambling and without any Frank Zappa music to listen to answer your question. But yes.
Right. Well, that's good. I've got a teenage daughter, two daughters actually. One is a teenager, and I've cautioned her that whatever you put on social media, just plan on that living forever. And that very dynamic is one of the things that gets exploited in the future, AI war. Could you describe what happens, that leverages, what people are doing online today, and how that can possibly come back to haunt them in the future?
Right. So I guess, like in this, I'm trying to think about what is cyber sovereignty. Like, we think ourselves as individuals operating in the online world, but where is the border of the nation state now that we have the internet as a kind of the way in which we, perhaps in an older world, we might have a mercantile world, but there's the sea. And how does the internet function in terms of sovereignty? What is the nomos and the shape of that environment? So and we can go and chat about that further. But in this particular case, it was like, well, you might target both the way society functions digitally online, or you might target someone's actual activity. So in this case, the protagonist, Chloe, is playing Fortnite and on TikTok, which both have been sort of fairly prominent in the media in the last year. And so say you move around tactically. I don't know if you play Fortnite, do you, John?
No, I am not a Fortnite player. No, I'm not.
I don't know if your daughter plays Fortnite. She's probably quite a good Fortnite
No,
player.
I don't think she does.
Right.
But you could substitute other games, I'm sure.
So like the way you move around Fortnite is sort of like an operator. So it's you're carrying a weapon and you're trying to basically kill everyone and be the last person standing.
Right.
So you might say that data. So you play 10,000 games over 2 years or something. Then what does that data tell you about how you might react to something in the future?
Right.
And then say you take all of Australian data about how Fortnite players who are all aged 10 and who will be operators out there in the field, or Marines operate out there in the field in 10 to 15 years, how do they behave?
Yeah.
What are their reactions? Where do they go? You really have a big data set on how someone might function operationally. And then something like a TikTok or like things like facial recognition, the way you walk, your gait, it can identify you straight away. So that means then you could match those two things up. And in this particular story, Chloe ends up in sort of entering Shenzhen on behalf of the corporation as a mercenary in this case. And the AI that's functioning has access to that earlier data. So it tries to predict how she will operate and move through the city, how she will fire, and it's able to identify if she turns up. So she turns up, she takes a mask off, bang, the facial recognition identifies who she is, and then it can draw on a data set to sort of begin to explore how would she function, what's she going to do next. So,
right. So data which was collected years before on her family, other people like her, was leveraged. The patterns within the data were leveraged in order to create a deep fake in close to real time that could potentially sidetrack Chloe from the mission at hand.
Right. And so that's happening at an individual scale. And how do we think about that at a sovereign scale? So
right.
say I had some Uber nation state, Uber, a tool which is an AI which is analyzing a nation state. So say I wanted to train an AI to understand what is Australia and what does Australia do online and how does it function digitally online. Like how would I understand what is a regular pattern? How would I train an AI as to think about what Australia is as a nation state? And then to some extent, how would I deceive that? How would I set up a data operation which targeted that and actually said, oh, let's set up some fake information against you, or let's screw with your algorithm for your AI that might be used out at 2040, because AI needs data to work on, right? So, and so it's the data that's created now is the data it's going to be using. So how would I create something for 2020 as a nation state? How would I define my cyber sovereignty, my sovereign space? And how would I even perhaps run a deception operation against another nation state with big data? That's, I guess, maybe another question, but I guess I'm trying to say this will operate at certain scales of weirdness that we don't really understand at this point.
That's right. And, these types of operation are as much about creatively deploying new techniques as it is about, honing, the data collection and the analytics that fuel the new techniques that can be deployed.
Right. And so that's where, the rubber hits the road in terms of what can be achieved and what is, to some extent, what I'm suggesting, science fiction.
Right. You also have an interesting discussion in the piece sovereignty. You mentioned it a moment ago, but where data rights, we've got data flowing all over the world from, my PC out through the interwebs, back to your PC, where do data ownership, what are the data ownership cut points, and how does sovereignty figure into all of that? And
Right.
you're mentioning historical analyses. Once upon a time, it was relatively easy to discern where one nation state's property ends and another begins. I mean, there were always squabbles around the margins, but those lines are completely blurred and are potentially just going to be completely obliterated as we continue forward.
Well, to some extent, they already are.
Mm-hmm.
So I draw a bit here on the work of Ben Bratton and his work on stacks.
Yes, yeah.
And how, I guess, so...
Explain stacks, please, for the audience.
Okay, so it's the idea that geopolitical nomos, so kind of what you're describing there, like a Westphalian sovereignty system, which is what 16th, 18th century. You have state borders physically on land, a mercantile system of nomos on water, where there's sort of open space that's non-territory, and then other spaces which are territory. And that sort of has existed really until the internet became quite live. And there's now this accidental megastructure that's called the internet, which we've all put together across all nations in a sense, and it's at planetary scales. So now, instead of there being, say, nation states functioning in terms of just their territorial physical borders, they function in stacks. So a stack, I suppose, it's pretty much an analogy of a stack in a computer in terms of a sort of a layered decision process within a computer, which kind of I exist as a user here on this Earth scale, and then there's the cloud, which data goes up into the cloud and then comes back down that chain. So it's essentially a metaphor that's applying the way in which you and I are using the internet right now, which my computer's type P, it's pinging yours and returning information back and forth through a physical but very vertical layer of structure, whereas the Westphalian system was horizontal and it's divided up between borders. Now we're seeing this blurring of those borders. So there's kind of two stacks now. There's like a PRC, a China-based stack. It's sort of a semi-Russian stack, and then there's a kind of another infosphere, which is sort of an Anglophone infosphere, which has Israel in it probably. So Australia, Israel, New Zealand, the United States is obviously the dominant force in that one.
Mm-hmm.
And the Brits are involved, so there's an Anglophone environment. And then the EU, as it starts to carve out its own data sort of legislation, is sort of becoming a semi-separate stack, but is sort of blurred with. So in a sense, the environment of both the Westphalian system and the geopolitical nomos of waterways is now framed within internets. So these stack environments, where I'm in your stack, but I'm really not much in the PRC stack right now.
Yeah.
So, and as an example, like we're using a particular piece of software, and it was found out at the early start of the pandemic that some of the services are run by Australian telecommunications company located in Beijing. And so the data was going through Beijing. So this is where you get the old with the new clashing. So like we define our world, as you suggested, Westphalian sense of here's the physical land of Australia. If the server's on Australia, then we consider it Australia. And we can probably say, okay, that's fair enough. But what does that mean then if that data goes out through Beijing and then it goes to the United States? Or what does it mean if that data, the Australian data, exists for politics, say, in the West Coast, it's sitting in Facebook and Twitter servers in the United States, and how are we then part of a US diaspora? And obviously, the PRC has a very firm structure. It's really dividing itself off and has a very firm firewall. And that's an example of another internal sort of stack. And I guess like Bratton talks about the first Sino-Google war of 2009, when Google sort of is forced out of China. And is that the nature of future conflicts, where we fight over stack v stack rather than nation state? So like it's sort of Baidu, sort of and Tencent versus sort of a GAFA like a Google, Apple. And what does that mean? The way in which I think it's a challenge for nation states currently, like how do we define what Australia is digitally, or the United States for that matter?
Right.
And how does it, where is our border?
Right.
And where is the data that is it sovereign data, that the data that you and I are sharing now, or is it individual? Who owns that data? And I guess the Europeans have taken a model with that particular angle with it. But
right.
So
do you see since we're talking about a work of fiction here, but it's infused with current reality. But do you envision a possible future where the nation state model that we currently have, I guess the Westphalian model, dissolves and we wind up in a world that is these large tech giants become the sovereigns somehow? And I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but it's something like that, right?
It's possible, and it's not unfeasible that might take place, and that's partly the way in which that sort of nationalism and nation state of the 17th century all the way through, which the US society, Australian society, are kind of based on an 18th century sort of intellectual construction, as the best way to organise a society or a group challenge to a particular problem, even an economic problem, like may undergo a transformation. So in which case it's not really about imports and exports anymore. It's about data, or it's about because, and to some extent, the PRC is backing some of the nation state competition between the two stacks currently is taking that form. So so our system, so the Anglosphere is based around IP protection as kind of a output of a production process, whereas for the PRC, they see that as just a cost to business.
Right.
So we'd be interested in a system where at stack v stack, value and economic value is extracted based on your rights to intellectual protection. And so the way you would target that is you might try and degrade the value of that IP, and if you can just produce knowledge cheaper, and it's just a cost, then to production, then you locate value and exchange somewhere else. And so that's how you might begin to start to hack stacks at planetary scales, at economic scales. And that's perhaps why the PRC is developing this model of closed firewall, because it wants to protect itself, even though it's dependent upon the IP, certainly in cyber, of essentially the United States.
Right.
It may want to try.
It's interesting. There's a bit of a historical echo here. I'm not a historian, but I believe the Chinese famously, back in maybe the 1400s or 1500s, there was a very famous Chinese captain. I forget his name, but he was sailing around the world, and the Chinese emperor at the time said, "We're not going to be doing any of this." And that decision to shut down, or for China to turn inward and not explore the outside world and bring in additional perspectives into the Chinese culture, that didn't work out too well for China for the next 500 or 600 years. And so it would be interesting if China's protection of their data, as you were just describing in these stacks, has some kind of a similar dynamic that does not work in their favor for the long term?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, like you're referring to, yeah, you're right. There was in the 1400s, there was these supersized junks that were like I guess the super tankers of the age. They went out across to Africa in particular. They certainly they came to the north of Australia and had a look around.
Yeah.
And they were, the person was exploring how to generate world trade. And yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like, how do you, at a strategic level, at a society level, restructure your response to the future? And yeah, that's an interesting question. Would that closure have a contradictory effect? It's an interesting question.
I don't know. I believe I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I think this is attributed to Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Right.
And I wonder if this could be a rhyming part of history. But I'm also reminded of another gentleman who I've been quite taken with this fellow's teachings and philosophy. I know I've mentioned this on the podcast. His name is Joseph Campbell, and he was as I said, a professor, a teacher of comparative religious studies, and he did a series called "The Power of Myth" back in the mid 1980s. That it was for me at least, it was just a stunning series of discussions about religion and myth and commonalities found throughout the world. Very interesting stuff. But one of the things that he said during this is that over time, you can tell what is most important in a society based upon what the tallest structures were within the society. So back in a lot of his stuff tended to be like Eurocentric. So if you think about Europe, back in the 1200s, the tallest buildings, the most majestic buildings in European cities and towns was the church. That was the biggest thing. But fast forward to today, the tallest buildings are these skyscrapers, which frequently, not all the time, but frequently are owned by banks. And so finance may be the most important thing in society these days, and you can tell because they're the biggest buildings. Well, here now you're bringing up this notion of data stacks, and data is arguably the most important thing, or information is the most important thing to the world today. And these data stacks may not be the tallest structures in the world, but the word stack is reminiscent of the word structure. And I've wondered for several years now, for the United States, if there might be a time in the next 10 or 15 years where the actual capital of the United States moves from Washington, D.C. to Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley is the most important hub for American infrastructure, activity, governance, et cetera, et cetera. And that also might be a harbinger of things to come that you discuss in your paper.
Yeah, so that's, we'll see. We might even see the emergence of the cyber city-state. So, and you think of like the way in which London is very separated from the rest of the UK. The way in which, say, the examples you bring up there, so California and Texas are responsible for 35% of US growth in the last 10 years. So all the growth in the economy is happening in those two states. And obviously the Valley is highly connected to the rest of us through this Anglosphere stack we're talking about before. So you may see the emergence of states breaking down into the previous organizations they had, and these city cyber states, which are sent up, vertically integrated into the stack, this sort of IP knowledge becoming certainly more important in those environments. and sort of an asymmetrical type of relationship within states, which kind of we're sort of seeing politically to some extent. And I suppose then the issue of, I guess, to draw a sort of a breakout box to the Campbell, like what is the importance of culture at a planetary scale? So like the way he talks about myth functioning, what does it mean really for myth to function transhistorically? And I guess the anecdote I would use in relation to Campbell is that, well, Campbell, as you know, is probably might have discussed this, is the basis for Star Wars in some ways, right?
Yes, that's right. He did. He had a connection with George Lucas. Yes.
So, but as someone who lives out in the cyber colonies, the off-world of Australia, like I sort of more think about the role of Kurosawa in Star Wars, for example. So the idea that there's these trans myths that exist, sort of he took and put into Star Wars, but really Star Wars is a copy of Kurosawa's films of the late 1950s and early 1960s, down to like characters he's ripped off, right? So what happens is that Kurosawa in the 1930s goes to a lot of, by his father, gets taken to like silent cinema and heaps of American Westerns, right? Then he cuts his teeth making war films, propaganda films in World War II, technically. And then in the 40s and 50s, he goes back to the Western and invents a Japanese Western, which is Seven Samurai, probably know all this, like the Two Cities one. And then the avant-garde cinema starts in America in the 60s. And Lucas gets dragged along by his mates to watch all these Kurosawa films, and he literally takes the plots from those films. So what is the role of like exchange and information exchange at a global scale, and how will that affect what happens at the micro scale when that was obviously cinema, so much more analog, like system. We have to carry cans around the world. Now we're in a space where there's much more blurring going on and much more accessible data. How will we see the myths change, to draw on Campbell? And what will be important part in those environments? Like so, I mean, Star Wars is kind of a space opera, but it's really a Japanese Western in the United States.
So I mean, just about any good, another bit of Campbell, one of his most well-known books, or maybe his most well-known book, is called The Hero's Journey,
right.
Which describes probably a dozen different world myths, each of which have a bit of a theme to them, which involve a person, a man or a woman, being called to do something greater than themselves. And it's, it's a theme throughout history. And I'm, struck by the notion of myths, not to go down like a religious hole here. It does, but just from a societal standpoint, having a story or something that helps to glue society together under some common theme that resonates. I've brought this up before in other guest discussions, but for America, at least, I'm a child of the 1970s and 1980s. There was the notion of, mom and dad and apple pie and baseball and blue jeans and the Marlboro Man and, these American type things that just kind of got created with nobody directing it, but it got exported to the world, and everybody in America, at least, kind of tended to rally around these things. I mean, that to me seems like we need some kind of a few things to grab onto as the free world, which resonates with everybody. They're not divisive. They're part of the glue that holds this ship together to continue our nautical metaphors.
Yeah. So, what will be the cultural? How do those cultural forms function in terms of large-scale stack environments and data environments? I mean, I guess as an historical reflection, like in Australia, because our nation was really sort of quote unquote invented at this turn of the century. And so it's sort of Gallipoli and the Anzac myth is the way in which we consider nationhood. And that is kind of it's Campbell in the sense of the 20th century notion of democracy, where you do give yourself to a higher cause, which is the empire or Australia, or and then we developed this whole mythology in the last 100 years around that particular form of sacrifice on a beach in Turkey, basically.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Whereas the United States has that. We're in this contradictory world now where the US has a model. It's quite 18th century in a sense. So we're using all these computers in a sort of reproduction Georgian house. And actually in the White House, a genuine Georgian house, 18th century house, really.
Good one.
So there are these, these crossovers and reflexivities between mythology and the technology, which is perhaps racing faster ahead of the mythology, or but is also mythology is binding us together. Yeah, it's. I think what you're talking about there is going to become a much more important aspect of the way in which we defend society strategically. Yeah.
I don't know how it'll wind up coming about. My gut tells me that it's virtually impossible to try to force something to manufacture a cultural myth or a societal rallying symbol, but something will likely emerge. And back to the notion about the hero's journey, frequently. And your example with Gallipoli is national unity is frequently forged by through adversity and trauma. 911, Gallipoli, it's on one hand, this is relatively good news in that the West in general has not experienced a major, and I'm talking like World War II major type of a calamity in a very long time. And I mean, that's great. There's been lots of people who have lived under a relatively free and society which has not been affected by the horrors of war. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been conflict. There has been, but not at the level of World War II, at least, or like the Gallipoli campaign that you were mentioning in World War I. I hope that this doesn't have to come to pass like this, but it does seem that human nature needs some sort of trauma in order to, forge some kind of unifying cohesion.
Certainly in the Westphalian model, and that's the question we keep asking ourselves now. Is Clausewitz's science of war still relevant? Like it's sort of invented, I guess, in the Napoleonic era when gunfire is still pretty slow. So is there a transhistorical human nature? Is there a transhistorical perception of what is conflict between humans? So it's I think sort of a lot of the technological change is forcing us to confront that question again.
Right. Yeah. And one last thing that you bring up in your piece, and maybe we can conclude on this,
right,
is the whole notion of what does PTSD look like in an AI fueled society? I when my dad was a kid, he told me a story one time about when he was a boy. In shoe stores, they used to have these X-ray machines in shoe stores where people could try on a new pair of shoes and then basically X-ray their foot to see how well the shoe fit. You put your shoe in this little box and you push the button and you get an X-ray of your foot. That doesn't fit too well. Well, 20 years later, there's like all these people that are, hobbling into doctors' offices with problems with their feet from X-ray, from radiation poisoning. Well, so what are the effects? What are the societal effects of being constantly online, constantly looking at screens, constantly having something in your ear, or in your piece, talking about having wires into the brain which are artificial and who knows what they're doing. So what does PTSD look like? And maybe that's our global trauma, which is part of our new mythology or something.
Yeah, so as you're saying, shell shock in the First World War was somewhat of a shock to everyone. And at the first the Napoleonic Wars are long forgotten, so the traumas and the Civil War, to some extent, also somewhat in the past. So what will be because as you're suggesting, like PTSD is it's not a category in psychology until 1980. And it's a consequence of the Vietnam War and the experiences there. But of course, it's been around since the year dot, and to some extent, like it appears in Shakespeare, it's described quite eloquently in Shakespeare. But that's the element when humans are fighting humans with some modicum of technology, say industrial PTSD is an industrial scale. The PTSD of the Vietnam era is quite later to the era. What are the eras of PTSD going to be when we start to have a neurolinkiness? Yeah, like you're suggesting, an augmented soldier that's functioning either biochemically or with CRISPR, when we can start to engineer things genetically. Where will that go? Because as you're suggesting, we just don't know the downstream effects of many things. I mean, work it out afterwards. So we have the Vietnam lasts from 64 to 72, 75, and then it's not till after we go, hang on a minute, that wasn't what we expected. So yeah, in this piece, I try and sort of consider what will happen to someone who's operating in that space in the future, and maybe, yeah, as you're suggesting, what is the collective trauma of being online? I mean, with Twitter, and just how online, like that escalated quickly, like is a famous Twitter phrase, but really the last the history of the graph model in Facebook didn't exist until 2010. So we didn't even have that model of seeing our life that way until 2010. And within the last 5 years, I suppose, just the way in which, like, instead of 5G conspiracy being located to a small group of individuals, it's now dispersed. And the heuristic biases that we talk about here in that crucible of cognition can be weaponized against the population scale, basically.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's as good a place to end. So with that, Tom Sear, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible, and let's to be continued in some future segment here.
No dramas, that'll be great.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.